And we are going to start with a first question, and they are going to open for question from the participants. My first question is about you. You explained these two ways to regulate human rights due diligence, and one was that including all the human rights, and the other was taking maybe one single right. No? So I was wondering what are the advantage and disadvantage of including single human rights in the human rights due diligence regulation.
Thank you, Luis, for your nice introduction and this first question on what the difference is between mandatory due diligence laws with just a single human rights topic or a broad human rights scope. And I think we could maybe even say it's a bit of a two generations of laws. The first generations of laws that have already started around 2010, 11, and so on, often deal with one aspect only. And the newest laws that are that have been passed are broader in scope and contain more human rights, or just include practically all human rights under the Bill of Rights. And coming to disadvantages and advantages, I think the advantage, if you have a single human right that a code addresses, like the Netherlands code on child labor, then it raises awareness to this issue. And in the first stage of mandatory legislation, when companies aren't so used to the mechanisms of human rights due diligence yet, they can sort of train this with looking at a single issue. And so I think this was a bit of the background. So there were problems with conflict minerals from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the conditions for miners there. So in the US, they adopted the Dodd-Frank Act, which introduced due diligence on conflict minerals. So companies manufacturing minerals from that region, gold, tungsten, and so on, they had to look into their supply chain to see if they actually sourced from that region and what the conditions were, or with child labor, and modern slavery and other issues. So the main advantage is it draws the awareness to that issue. And I think from a legal point of view, you could imagine that the law then, if it only addresses one issue, asks more of companies than to just look superficially. But then you would expect them to go right deep into their supply chain. But we can see some examples that this really isn't true for all the laws. Yeah, the most blatant bad example could be seen as the law from the UK, the Modern Slavery Act. It addresses modern slavery and says to look into it for the whole of the supply chain, but it's only a reporting law. So a company isn't even obliged to undergo due diligence. So it doesn't necessarily have to take action to analyze all risks and take action, but it can just report that it hasn't taken any steps in the area of modern slavery. So not always is is sort of the idea that addressing a single issue will take a company deep into their supply chain really true. And I think with the broader ambit, of course, you diminish one disadvantage with single issues. That's also that if a company only looks into modern slavery, it doesn't have any incentive to look into other labor abuses which may lead to modern slavery. Yeah, and if you have a law that addresses all sorts of human rights, then of course companies will have to look into their supply chain and at all sorts of human rights risks. So I think without over um, well, with companies only having to do what is appropriate, I think it's always preferable or quite preferable to have the broader laws with more human rights covered than just a single issue. That was
Okay,
a longish answer.
no, thank you. Thank you so much. I forgot to mention that Stephanie is a professor for business law, especially employment and labor law at the Berlin School of Economics and Law. So thank you so much for your answer. So now we have the time and the opportunity to ask Stephanie some questions. So for please raise your hand. Okay, go ahead, Benji.
Yeah, hi Luis. Hi to everyone. So my question to Stephanie is, I have worked with workers in supply chains, mostly those in garments, at times also in electronics, and just to increase their leverage, because it's very hard to organize unions in the export processing zones here in the Philippines. Uh, so we've tried to increase leverage by trying to engage the brands, try to use even all the stakeholder codes if any. Uh, anyway, we haven't had the chance to use those laws you mentioned in the video, like the UK modern slavery, the French duty to vigilance, and even the German. Well, of course, it's very new, so probably not many people yet have had the chance to like try to engage using the German supply chain law, right? So I don't know. So I was thinking, how much of a coverage or even utility those laws have, given just in our, or just in my, of course, also limited experience, we haven't had the chance to try to use those laws in order to help workers have find remediation, right? So yeah, so just I don't know if you have any comment about that, or maybe we just have to try to but learn a bit. Maybe there's still some use we haven't found yet. So any ideas? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the $10,000 question, Benji. So it's really I think a question that will put these laws to the test. Yeah, to see how much can unions or workers on the ground really also make of them. And I think there's some experience now with the French law. They have the French duty of vigilance law, which covers all sorts of human rights, and its ambit is quite big. And there have been some first cases launched, for instance, with Total, the oil and gas company Total, and also an electrics firm EDF for a wind park in Mexico and in Bolivia, and we've seen that it's quite the involvement of workers in the countries themselves is quite difficult, because first of all, often they don't know about the laws. So you need the civil space for NGOs, for local NGOs, to actually work with the issue. So that's one thing. Then also to translate the sort of the possibilities of remedy into a language and knowledge of people there has proved really difficult. Then there's been an example of indigenous groups actually being split, but also the involvement of the company. So there have allegedly, this we don't really know, but there have been bribes to some tribal leaders, and which split the local community and made them even weaker in terms of getting remedy. And then so what is actually only proved to work in a certain sense is if local NGOs and local communities match up with the NGO scene in the consumer countries. Yeah, so in the case of Bolivia, there was a Canadian NGO that teamed up with the local NGOs, and then they raised or filed a claim in France. Yeah, because it will still it will be difficult under that law to file a claim for a local community in France. Right, that's a difficulty you will still have, but at least materially there's something you can base it on. And I think actually what this points to is that in the aftermath of these laws being made, still civil society will need to build up a network, and unions will have a role maybe in building up a network of witnessing labor abuses in producing countries and documenting them, and then sort of mainstreaming them into the obligations of these companies on their reporting duties and so on. Yeah, and they also there's always an obligation to have a grievance mechanism or a complaint mechanism. Yeah, so this is something that in the future local groups can make use of, that they document complaints and file them into the complaints mechanism, and then the company needs to do something to address. And if they don't, then you can move on to remedy. So I think maybe the steps, some of the steps we know from before from CSR have remained the same, but the hope is, and we don't have so much evidence on it yet because the laws are new, but the hope is that because now you have a legal statutory obligation with sanction mechanisms in the consumer countries of the global north, that you will have the step for remedy will become easier, or the success of remedy will become easier.
Yeah, thank you. That is a key element. We were talking in the last workshop about that risks, to that the human rights due diligence becomes like a new sophisticated way of corporate social responsibility, just like that. And you I think you talk about a key point, that is the access to remedy,
Yeah.
That is very, very important. I don't know if there is another question, please.
Maybe let me go on to say that I mean the main hope is that there won't be so much need for remedy. Yeah, the main hope is actually that prevention will be better, that actually companies do look into their purchasing practices and raise wages to living wages, or check more with their suppliers about the working conditions, even in EPZs, and also that governments will be incentivized maybe by the pressure on the corporations will build up to say, okay, we'll try not to have our comparative advantage from lowering labor standards. And well, with the German law, which has just been passed, that's a bit of my hope that since they have to undertake due diligence mainly with direct suppliers, but if there's substantiated knowledge coming from complaints, for instance, about abuses with second tier or third tier suppliers, then the companies need to address it. Otherwise, there may be severe sanctions, and the supervisory mechanism under the French law is purely from private initiative. So it's left to the market and NGOs. But in Germany, for instance, there will be a regulatory agency. And the hope is with building this up from the beginning that you will raise their awareness to involving stakeholders straight from the beginning and so on, which is something that under the French law, it's there on paper and in the books that you need to involve stakeholders. But in practice, trade unions haven't been mentioned in their first reports at all. So that's something.
Thank you for that clarification. I think Benji has a question.
Yeah,
Please
no,
go ahead.
just a quick reaction to Stephanie. I guess I'll take her advice and take a look at maybe how these laws can still be used. We actually have an experience, a French company in a export processing zone. Although it's kind of small, so I don't think it will fall into the 150 to 300. That's the scope of the French law. But we do have Total here in the Philippines. So I don't know, maybe one of these days, maybe there's something to knock on the doors of Total. But that, unfortunately, most of the suppliers here or locators are owned by, well, American, Japanese, Korean. And unfortunately, they don't have, right? I don't know if I'm wrong. They don't have anything similar to those HRDD laws that you mentioned.
Yeah. So it's right. The Americans and the Korean don't have these the broad mandatory laws. So that the chance there may be that they are involved somewhere in the supply chain of a big French company, for instance, because then the French parent company passes on their due diligence obligations to the other companies included. This is something that has happened quite a bit with the Dodd-Frank Act for conflict minerals. Yeah, because there all companies listed at a US stock exchange have this obligation, and that then covers quite a large number of companies in the supply chain of these companies again.
Thank you. Now, Honey has a question. Please go ahead.
Hello, good evening. Stephanie, thank you for engaging us in this conversation. It's actually my first time to learn about this approach, so I'm just absorbing everything. So my first question for Stephanie is sort of clarificatory. It seems to me that this approach would only be potent if there is an enabling law in a country for this to take root and for this to be potent. Is that correct? Like our legislature of a country has to have an enabling law for it to have some effect in the country. For example, the Philippines. And second, the second question is more exploratory, and it's not fully developed, but I would just like to articulate it as best as I can. I've read in some references that some people are trying to make a distinction between approaches addressing labor issues, which is for them is too legalistic. So, for example, this due diligence framework. So it's legalistic, and second, they're drawing a division between these legalistic approaches to more militant approaches or more direct approaches employed by labor movement in various countries. So I was just wondering whether do you see that division as valid, whether these due diligence framework is too legalistic and that and whether it makes sense to make distinction between more militant direct action approaches, and and if that division is true, do you see as these two approaches as complementary, or that do they have a tension between each other? So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Honey. Two really good questions. The first one about the enabling law in, say, the producing country like the Philippines. Um, from from the theory of these laws, you wouldn't need that, because and that's the whole idea, actually, because I think the outset is to say that we've seen over the past decades that many of the countries that produce a lot of what is sold and consumed in the global north, they have a good framework of laws, but the implementation is a problem, and often there's no political will to really implement to the core, or you introduce EPZs to draw investment and so on. So the whole idea was to say, why don't we implant the laws where the headquarters of companies, trade companies are situated? We put the laws there, and we make them look into the way they produce, and thereby we transcend also the borders of legal territoriality. Yeah, so actually the idea is to say, if you are a big, if you're a Nestle or Orange or some French or German company, then but you have some parts of your products that are sourced from the Philippines, and you have to check under which labor environmental conditions that is happening there, without a law in the Philippines that says, yes, you can do it. Yeah, so that's the whole hope. And I think one reaction to this hope is already sort of part of your second question, to say, well, it's actually quite a legalistic approach, and it may not have much effect. And yeah, you know, I'm a lawyer, so I sort of believe in legal approaches, but I'm fully with you to say it can't be the only thing. I think you do need other forms of activist support to this, because you can't rely on business, which has caused much of the problem, just on its own to also resolve it. Without, you need the political will in the countries that are making the laws, but you also need support from the local governments. And how can you get that support? Probably also by some pressure from bottom up, yeah, and some activist support. So I think it's less of a division, more than a complementary thing.
Thank you. Thank you. There is another question. I have a couple of questions, but I hope that somebody can have another question, or not yet. Well, I'm going to go ahead. It's about this last point. No? You mentioned that we are hoping that the corporation can follow the law this time, no, and can prevent. So first is a small question. No? Why do we have to have that hope? No, we already saw what happened with the corporate social responsibility. No, that they didn't follow their internal rules. No, so why does that hope come from? That's the first one, and the second part is more about from the south. No, in one of the small group session that we had, we were talking that this human rights due diligence looks like a more like a top to the bottom strategy, right? So how from the south we can create some kind of complementary approach to try to connect with that. No, I mean, for example, in Peru, the mining workers, they need like some remedy like right now, no, in the short term. So how we can create that? We were talking, for example, more involvement about the state, no, in the suppliers country, but we don't know. I would like to know your perspective about that point. Thank you.
Okay. Also that I think all the questions that you're bringing are really to the very core of this issue. Is it a useful concept or not? So I'm very grateful that you're asking them. I strongly believe that these mandatory laws are really something different from CSR if we use them well, because with CSR we only had hope, yeah, because they were voluntary, and you could, with activism, you could push for better solutions, and also you could push for better solutions in supply chains with rare earths or with commodities that aren't available all over the world, with cocoa or certain minerals. But you couldn't really push too well. You had little leverage with garments or products like that. And I think now what's changed with the mandatory due diligence is that the companies that fall under the personal scope have a legal obligation. They have a legal obligation to assess risks and to address risks, to develop indicators, to check those indicators, to monitor whether what they've done to address a certain risk by altering their purchasing practice, whether it really has a good effect. And if they don't, there are sanctions. And so it depends, of course, how well the laws are constructed. And I think some laws, like the German law, which has an administrative fine of up to 800,000 euro for breach of the due diligence law, that can be quite a threat. In addition to the reputational threat. So I think it should be a two-pronged strategy. On that, straight from the beginning, it should be clear that people are actually watching to see if companies are now fulfilling this legal obligation, or otherwise the regulatory agency will be addressed to check on them. And the other thing is that for workers, they also have rights as stakeholders. All these laws envisage that somehow stakeholders should be involved, and that not only should they be involved, but it's their rights that are supposed to be respected. So somehow, some energy also needs to go into documenting these the labor rights violations and channeling that back to the agency or the supervisory mechanism. Yeah. So, and I think that's probably a difficult step, because you need to organize people on the ground. You need to get to know how is the grievance mechanism set up, how to make use of it. Yeah. So, but I think all of these laws have some of that, and that's the potential.
Thank you for that clarification. And I would like to know if there is more questions. Yes, please go ahead, Gian.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Stephanie. I just have a small question that, as I understand that the HRDD will not only be applied for the buyer countries, but also for maybe not right now, but maybe in the future, it will be for the suppliers country also. So my just only one concern that it will increase the cost, because now they apply a lot of auditing in the supplier chain. They have more auditing with the company, the factory, manufacturing. But now if they apply this law, and the company will have to somehow as I understand that they will increase the more requirement, and that means that the factory will have to pay for that cost. So especially for SME when they particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, in my country, in Vietnam, we're working in garment industry, and a lot of broke. They are broke now. So how to overcome this one? Because if the cost is increased and it affects the enterprises, not only for the supplier, and then somehow it will very severe impact on the worker. So how to your point, how we can overcome this one?
Yeah, that's also a really good point, and I think that's a bit of a white hole in the whole mandatory due diligence concept, that for the lawmakers here in the northern countries, because they think, or that's the whole concept, the whole thing is conceived as a sort of trickle down. So you make the law, then the law will influence suppliers for the better, and then they will pass on, or it will, first of all, it will influence company policies. They will change their purchasing practices, and more is passed on to suppliers, and suppliers will then pass on more to workers. Yeah, but there is definitely evidence that it doesn't work out that easily, because also the cost suppliers are often in the weak. They're very much under competitive stress with other suppliers, so the cost issue for them is a big point. And the suggestion there is also that to say proper due diligence involves not only passing on the due diligence obligation to suppliers, but to really get into dialogue with them, and to probably set up some cost sharing scheme, so that they will be enabled to pass on the benefits to the workers. Yeah, and I think this is that's something that needs to reach the departments in the covered companies a bit more, yeah, and also the supervisory agencies. That's something they need to look into too. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer. Is great to have those clarification. Thank you. Is there any other question? Please raise your hand. No. Oh, and Lira, please go ahead.
Stephanie, thanks a lot for these explanations. But does there come a point where you would say, even for some small and medium enterprises, if their only competitive advantage is actually exploiting workers and violating the labor law, actually they shouldn't exist? I mean, they shouldn't be in the market. So yes, we understand this one, that you need gradual application of the law, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises, and give some time for this to trickle down. But is there how long would this continue? I mean, we know this also for other issues that small and medium-sized enterprises are often, for instance, excluded from collective bargaining, sectoral collective bargaining agreements, and so on. So I'm just curious. So, is there some sort of an estimate at which point one would say, well, the time is enough? If you cannot actually comply with certain labor regulations, perhaps you shouldn't be operating, even if you are a small and medium-sized enterprise. I'm just curious, what's the debate on that?
I haven't really thought about it from that angle before, because my approach is always to say that look at the circumstances, and I see also an important role for the governments in the producing countries as well. Yeah, they should be given an incentive to move away from low labor cost as a comparative advantage. Yeah, and that incentive, and they should then design industrial policies or also extend collective bargaining and so on, so that more small and medium-sized enterprises will be able to offer solid working conditions. Yeah, so I find it hard to say in X number of years or after X time of experience with these new laws, if there are still companies building their business model on violation of labor rights, they should just be off the grid. But probably that's what would happen, I guess.
Okay, thank you so much. Is there any additional question? Well, okay, Stephanie, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is also Stephanie. I'm from Berlin too. So I was wondering, with the last question that was raised, how can we actually solve this kind of ongoing conflict that we have, especially with states where where states are not giving any incentives on mandatory due diligence for human rights or also for environmental standards, which, for example, I always think of China and the impact this has on the competitive advantage of other nations who actually do care about human rights and environmental standards. So will we have a chance to actually solve this ongoing conflict?
Another $10,000 question.
Yeah.
It's not the first time this question is raised, so I always believe that it's good to still do something, even though there may be parts of the world where this isn't happening. On a smaller scale, we've revisited this argument with parts of the political debate in Germany, saying, well, the German companies will completely lose their competitiveness if we introduce a mandatory due diligence law. We should wait for a European solution. Yeah, and that's on a bigger scale. It's the same thing with China or other players. Should the EU not move because China may outcompete them? I think we should still do something, and for those countries that are not so willing to move into the direction of mandatory due diligence, I think there are other things happening globally that will induce them to go up that path to a certain extent. So if we look at, for instance, greenhouse gas emissions and conditions linked to that, for instance, by investors. Yeah, so there's more conditions to getting credit and from investors linked to this sort of environmental due diligence. And there, I think there's some hope in that also, that that social due diligence may be able to piggyback that to a certain extent, and become part of that debate in other countries as well. But yeah, it's a big issue. It's not an easy one to tackle.
Thank you. If there is another question, I have just the last quick question is about since one of the goal is to empower workers, no, in this process, what could be your approach or recommendation? So how workers, especially from the global south and allies, can do to try to include in this mandatory due diligence collective rights, no, union rights, because I think that is very important to understand that the collective rights are part of human rights, no, and are connected. So what could be your recommendation?
Thanks, Luis. I think what can be empowering is actually to get into the nitty-gritty of the laws, and that, I mean, that sounds terrible. That sounds like the codes of conduct of 10,000s of firms that we had before. But the good news is that I think there's been some mainstreaming under the UN Guiding Principles. So the nitty-gritty actually means that often these due diligence laws have the same couple of steps: the risk assessment. Are there any human rights risks? Addressing them, correcting and monitoring them, documenting, and so on. So if these steps are known, then on the ground, you can press for that to happen. You can say, me or us as the representative union, we should be involved in mentioning the risks. There is serious discrimination, or the wages are too low, or overtime is, or health and safety, and so on. So these are the risks that you're supposed to address. So first of all, being involved in risk assessment, then also being involved in the corrective action schemes to see what has actually been done, and also to have a voice in that, to be shown the corrective action plans, and to voice whether you think they've been followed or implemented or not, and to push for grievance mechanisms and to use them to complain on about violations further. And then I think there's something also about the networking with northern and southern NGOs and unions to use the even more legal mechanisms in the global north for those purposes and for remedy.
Thank you so much for that question. And we have, well, the last one is by Stephanie has another question, I think.
Thank you very much, Luis. I was wondering if there is any scientific evidence that the well-being of workers enhance after governments introduce mandatory due diligence legislation. So to conquer this argument that, well, if the rest of the world is not doing anything, why should we do something? So, because that's something that I always step up on. So if there is any evidence or any studies that you could provide us with, that would be very great. Thank you.
Okay, so there is actually, there are only sort of very specific studies on certain laws, and for instance, there's some stuff on the Dodd-Frank Act with conflict minerals, and something on U.S. modern slavery legislation. So I can look into that, but there's really no more general studies, especially for the new laws, because they're still so novel.
Thanks. We have two more questions. Can you go ahead, Gian, please?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to ask a very small questions about have you think about the level of violation, and if a company they violate the who will be the responsible for that, the CEO or the member of the BOD? So maybe when the law is applied, we can know exactly who will be responsible if they have violation.
I'll just quickly say that's usually why there's supposed to be some complaint mechanism, often even anonymous. So and outside, often outside the company, so that there won't be any harassment because of the complaint. Yeah, and that's something to look out for. And so it's not, I mean, the CEO is always responsible, but I don't know if you if you want to hand your complaint to the CEO.
Yeah. Joshua has a question. Joshua, can you go ahead, please?
Okay, thank you, Luis. I was asking how these outsourcing companies, especially the agencies, are going to be compelled to apply these laws. Because usually, when they employ workers, the agencies say it is their workers, and then the companies also say the otherwise. So I'm asking, how are you going to force or compel outsourcing companies and the agencies to be able to apply the laws? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so of course the further down or up the supply chain you go, from smaller suppliers to agents to maybe home workers and other informal workers, the further away you are sort of from first tier or headquarters, the more difficult it becomes to apply the law. But again, it has to do something with appropriateness. So if you're in a garment trading company, then you know that home workers are something common. Yeah, and then you also have to look into that issue and take care of the working conditions there. Yes, and it's so I think maybe it's probably not a satisfying answer because we don't have an experience yet on the ground how to really pressurize companies, but on the books there is the right. So we have to check the mechanisms with the supervisory agencies in the country where the laws are made, and with complaint mechanisms and union networking in the producing countries.
Thank you. If there is not any additional question, I just want to finish saying thank you to Stephanie for her time and for the wonderful video lecture that she shared with us in the course. And just a quick reminder that we have another Zoom workshop today, but also this coming Friday and the next week also. So please check your emails. Thank you again, Stephanie, and hopefully we will see you soon.
Yeah, and thanks also for joining and bringing in all your experience and thoughts from all over the world. I think it's well heard here, and it moves me quite a lot to see that there are such expectations also with these laws, and I think it should it should be a lesson for us and also a reminder for us to take it very seriously and to move forward with it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Stephanie.